All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to, as Zerlinda just mentioned, welcome to the last day. And so we're just going to tie up a few loose ends here with Israel and Palestine, and then we'll be done, right? Because we are. I'll mention to you or I'll just review very quickly with you that we talked about what we were talking about yesterday. And so, of course, you can see what's now Israel, right on the shore of the Mediterranean there, with lots of other big countries around them. And lots of this area was under the control of the Ottoman Empire prior to World War I. But as we get into World War I, the Ottoman Empire is kind of starting to fall apart. And then partway through World War I, it actually does come apart. The Ottoman Turks kind of lose control, and the British and the French are there to kind of attempt to divide up the Middle East in a way that benefits them, right? And so we heard about, or we read about yesterday that the British tried to keep an interest in places like Egypt. They had the Suez Canal there connecting the Red Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, which they wanted continued access to. And so, there were colonial powers that were still kind of trying to manage their own interests in this part of the world before the First World War, during the First World War, and after the First World War, right? But it was really kind of the Second World War where things, where we kind of set the stage for Israel and Palestine right now. So we said Palestine is kind of the traditional term or the historic term for this part of the world, right? Israel is kind of a new invention. But of course, there's Arab Palestinians living there, but also the Jewish people call this their traditional home as well, right? And so, again, this area had been part of the Ottoman Empire. Previously, it has been controlled by all kinds of different groups throughout history. Sometimes the Egyptians, sometimes the Romans, sometimes who else? The Parthians, and all kinds of different groups have controlled this part of the world. But again, more recently, it's the Ottomans, and then after that, it becomes kind of a British mandate, right? And so it's under the control of the British, although as you can imagine from the revolts that are happening in 1920 and 29 and 36, that the Palestinians are not entirely happy with British rule, right? There's also lots of Jewish people kind of immigrating back to Palestine after World War I, and definitely after World War II, right? And so because of the activities of the Nazis in the 1930s and the early 1940s, Jewish people attempt to flee Europe, and one of the places they attempt to flee to is, in fact, Palestine. And so some Palestinians are able to get into, or some Jewish people are able to get into Palestine, and they start to kind of create communities there. But there's also at the time Zionists, right? People who are in favor of creating a state for the Jewish people themselves, right? And that cause is kind of taken up by the UN, and by 1946 or 1948, we actually have a state of Israel, right? So I'm just going to, yes, I'll go back here. So we read yesterday about how basically once the State of Israel was created in 1948, war followed closely afterwards, right? And one of the reasons why it followed closely afterwards is, so just jump ahead here, is that neither the Palestinians nor the Israelis liked the UN's partition, right? So you can see there prior to the partition plan, all of this was Palestine, but increasingly Jewish people were moving into different parts of the area, right? And so the UN decided, okay, we're just going to draw a line around all of those Jewish settlements, and that'll be Israel, and you know, the rest will be Palestine, and there we go, job done, right? But again, the Palestinians didn't like the idea. They were basically losing half of their country when they had been promised that they would have their own state. The Jewish people didn't like this either because they were all segmented, right? They were all separated from each other, and they feared that they feared threats to their security, right? And keep in mind, they're in a part of the world where, you know, they're not really surrounded by their friends, right? They're really surrounded by their enemies. And so this partition plan that happens here almost immediately is unpopular with everyone. The Israelis and the Palestinians go to war, and go to war a number of times throughout the 1950s and 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s at least. And what that results in is basically Israel winning territory and confining Palestinians to this area called the West Bank and this Gaza Strip right by the Mediterranean. And so as time has gone on, more and more Jewish people have emigrated to Israel. They've built new settlements and new neighborhoods, and they're kind of encroaching on places that used to be for the Palestinians. And so eventually the Palestinians are kind of being pushed into smaller areas and pushed into Gaza. And it's kind of a question of where these people are going to go, right? Especially when, you know, arguably this was their territory 50 or 60 years ago. And now the Israelis have shown, or the Jewish people have shown up. Israelis have kind of pushed them into smaller and smaller areas. And, you know, again, it's difficult to know where these people are going to go. And already you can see here that Gaza is one of the most densely populated cities. Sorry, that's not, there's some typos there. One of the most densely populated cities in the world, right? Because again, all of those Palestinians have been pushed into this tiny, tiny little area, right? We see that, you know, the Israeli government controls most of Israel. We have the West Bank was controlled by this Fatah party at the time. They're kind of moderate and they're sort of cooperating with Israel. But Gaza is controlled by Hamas, right? And Hamas is a more extreme kind of borderline terrorist organization who is fighting for the rights of Palestinians, right? And so, but again, every rocket that Hamas shoots at Israel, Israel comes back with another one, right? And unfortunately for the Palestinians, Israel's rockets are much, much better, right? And so these two groups have kind of been locked in conflict for 50 or 60 years, and they haven't, you know, we haven't really seen any progress in terms of peace, and things continually get worse and worse for the Palestinians, right, as they are slowly pushed out of their land, pushed out of their neighborhoods, you know, with the backing of the Israeli military, right? And so once upon a time, yes.
Is it the U.S. or the UN?
That's a good question. Who is to blame here? Because the girl you were talking to, Ben, last week or whenever it was, the girl you were talking to, she definitely seemed to think that Israel was to blame, yes?
Yeah.
Yeah. And are they?
It's hard to say.
I mean, in this situation, I think everyone was promised something, and no one followed through with any of the promises. And I feel like everyone, the Israelis and Palestinians, they're just fighting for what they believe in.
Yeah.
So in that scenario, I don't think you can really blame anyone.
And I think like
Or everyone.
Yeah, you either blame everyone or you can't blame anyone. It's not fair because they both have like a valid reason.
Yeah.
They were both in a way betrayed by the UN. It was the UN.
In a way. Sorry, before you forget, Andre, what were you going to say? You forgot. I was worried. I was like, I got to get to Andre because he's going to forget what he said, and then okay, let me know if you
but
come.
like, yeah, like, if they were both fighting like, for the land, their land,
Yeah.
I think like the U.S. may be worse, like just supporting one side, then like the other side gets weaker,
Yeah.
and they still promise them something, but they never get it.
Yeah.
So
Well-
I think like, yeah, everyone's to blame, but not at the same level.
Very true, right? So yeah, so the UN has, the UN didn't really come up with a very good plan, as it turns out. But yeah, the US has been heavily supporting Israel. So Israel's military is solid, right? They have a solid military force. But again, that's because of the Americans who have dumped that into their country.
What was the reason of the US backing Israel?
The U.S. mostly backed Israel, I think, because a couple of reasons.
All assume were beneficial to the US.
Yeah, so Israel is nicely strategically located, right, in the Middle East, in a place where the U.S. doesn't have a lot of friends, right? They used to have a friend in Iran, right, with the Shah of Iran, who would heavily lean toward the U.S., but then he was overthrown in 1979, and so the Americans kind of lost a friend there, although this predates that. But the Middle East is a place where the Americans don't have a lot of friends, but they do have a lot of economic interest, and so it's very useful for them to have a place where they can, land their fighter planes and bombers in a friendly country, right? And so that's useful to them. Again, there are a pretty solid population of evangelical Christians in the U.S. And evangelicals, part of what they believe, it's a Christian religion, but part of what they believe is that, before the end of the world, before the big judgment, all the Jews will return home to Israel, right? So those people have an interest in kind of supporting Israel, right? Because that's part of their whole belief system, is that the Jews will eventually return home. And so and to be honest, I don't know where that belief comes from. Catholicism has no such idea, but so they're in favor of supporting Israel for that reason as well, right? Plus the U.S. had a hand in creating Israel because they're part of the United Nations, so they want to support them. Plus, there was still a lot of feelings about of kind of, I guess, guilt about the Holocaust and wanting to protect the Jewish people, and so there's kind of a leftover residue of that, I think, as well. So there's kind of a lot of reasons why the U.S. supported Israel to the degree that they did. Some of them are in the self-interest of the U.S. for sure, but yeah, it's Andre.
I think it's like the kind of thing Germany did, like when they went to was it in Mexico? Yeah, like I think the U.S. has like a plan or something. Like, if anything happens bad, like I think the U.S. has of course they have an army like in the Israel.
Yeah.
So that like anything that happens in the Middle East, like they have problems,
They can be there.
be there anytime.
Yeah.
I think it's like just strategic. It's beneficial to both of them.
Yeah. Well, and
It's
there's
like they occupy their country, like a small part of it. They put like some of their resources there,
yeah.
and then they give them like more land.
And there's a bit of a Cold War aspect to this as
Yeah.
well, right? Because the U.S. was supporting Israel, but of course the Arab Palestinians were being supported by the Soviet Union, right? So, we have this kind of old school colonialism before, right? So the Ottoman Empire falls apart, and the British and French are trying to, carve up the Middle East, and who's going to have control of this part and who's going to have control of this part. They're making promises to Palestinians and to and to Jews at the time. Then we have the UN kind of interfering in there. Then we have the US who are in there trying to maintain their strategic and economic interests. And yeah, there's a lot of people kind of sticking their nose in this part of the world, right? And probably, I don't know if they're making things better or worse, but there's a lot of interference going on, right? And people are interfering for their own reasons, right? It's not about helping Israel and Palestine so much, it's about advancing their own interests, right? Whether it's maintaining trade routes, whether it's maintaining a strategic base somewhere, whether it's gaining control of the Suez Canal, whether it's a religious thing, whether it's trying to counter the Soviets because you're in a Cold War with them, or vice versa. Whatever it is, a lot of countries and the UN have been interfering in this part of the world for a long time, right? And again, the fundamental issue here is that both of these groups claim the same land as their own, and they want their state to be there. And of course, that's just not possible, right? You can't have two countries occupying the same piece of land, right, at the same time. It's just logistically impossible, right? But that said, there's been so much interference, there's been so much violence, there's been so much warfare that the two sides haven't been able to come to any accommodation, right? And
Do you think they'll ever be able to come to an accommodation?
do you?
Maybe if the
No.
like this.
At the rate it's going right now, I don't think so.
There's a new partition plan, maybe, but like a fair one.
But at the same time, I also don't think like anyone would be happy if
Yeah.
there were to be a new
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
plan.
well, that's the kind of the problem, right? Is that if we look at the far right picture, if we drop a new partition plan,
It's a bit too late.
Yeah.
yeah, like it basically it means that Israelis are going to be kicked out of their homes, and there's again lots of Israeli families have in that West Bank territory that used to belong to Palestine, they've built their houses there, right? And they're not doing anything wrong, right? Developers created a neighborhood, built houses. These people want a house to live in and to raise their family, and so they buy a house, right? And they're not really trying to do anything wrong, but in doing so, they've pushed the Palestinians out. And so what do? Do you go to all those Jewish families and say, I'm sorry, but this belongs to Palestine now, so
Tough luck.
get out? Like that's not going to go over very well. And to some degree that's not really right either. But again, we seem to have gotten to the point where there's not much land left that Israel doesn't control. And so a two-state system would require Israel giving up quite a bit. And is that possible? I don't know. I think I would agree with you, Ben, that not so much anymore.
But then another question I have is, what happens once Israel has fully taken control of everything, every part? Will it still be controlled like the way it is right now?
It's a good question. It's a good question. It would be nice to see a situation in which Israelis and Palestinians could jointly govern one country. Because again, it doesn't make any sense to try and physically separate anymore because it's just not possible. But again, that a partition plan entails Israel giving up physical territory, but that would require Israelis to give up political power, right? You're saying, okay, there's Palestinians and Israelis. That means we need, reasonably equal, representation in government. But will Israelis want to give up that amount of political power? I would say no, because nobody ever wants to give up any power. But again, like you're sort of wondering here, what's the solution, right? Where did these people go?
Yeah, because even if they take control of the land, Palestinians will still be there, won't they?
Well, and in a way, that's effectively what Gaza has become, right? Because Gaza is blockaded, and there are checkpoints in and out. Israel closely monitors what goes in and what leaves Gaza, and so they're basically imprisoned, in this one area. And again, they can leave, but like, where to go, right?
I think like this was playing with the line of genocide.
Well, some people have accused it of being apartheid. So just like we saw in South Africa with this sort of segregation of black South Africans and white South Africans, and the fact that white South Africans held all the power and they marginalized black South Africans, we're seeing something similar here, right? Where Israelis hold all the power and they're kind of segregating Palestinians, but of course they're also slowly pushing them out. And there's lots of Palestinians who have left Israel and claimed refugee status in another country because there's just nowhere left for them to go or to live, right? And again, Hamas is still fighting for the Palestinian cause, but again, every rocket that they launch at Israel,
Essentially
gets a
doesn't do
rocket
anything,
back.
right?
What's that?
It doesn't really do anything
Not much. Not much. They don't have, again, Palestine doesn't have the political or the economic or the military power to make Israel do anything. And Israel could basically, rain missiles down on Gaza and destroy the entire thing. Obviously the world would condemn them, but they clearly have the firepower to do it. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't see. Ultimately, unfortunately, I think that's what happens, is that eventually all the Palestinians either leave or are killed in rocket attacks because Israel will not share power and the Palestinians don't have, they don't have enough leverage.
Is it considered war? It is.
Well,
Because if it's war, they would be sanctioned after it's over.
it kind of depends on who you talk to, I think, right? Because the people, some of the, what was his name? Abdel Nasser there, the kind of rich kid that we met in the video yesterday, he would probably say they're not at war, right? He's living in the West Bank. His parents are kind of doing well and profiting from the situation. And so he doesn't see warfare at all, right? He's just hanging out, living his life. But people in the Gaza Strip are, basically locked in there under, the guard of the Israeli military. And so those people probably feel like they're at war. People in the West Bank, not so much, maybe. Right? And so I think that the Israeli government will continue doing what they're doing, pushing Palestinians out of their territory, and if Palestinians fight back with violence or with weapons, then the Israeli army will oppose them, right? And I don't think that, I think that it's just going to be a slow pushing out of those people. Again, unless the international community stands up and says something, but
Nothing's happening.
I don't see, most people don't seem to have an appetite for that anymore. And you saw in the video, some US presidents have tried to take an active role there. We saw Bill Clinton, we saw Barack Obama, and the attempts have been made, but nothing has changed. Donald Trump, of course, was a heavy supporter of Israel. And Joe Biden has been in the past as well, but
I think Trump was just a business first thing. Business was our first for like everything.
well, yes, and Donald Trump actually has a lot of his supporters are evangelical Christians.
Yeah.
So if he's smart, which I'm still not sure about, but if he's smart, he will support Israel because the people who are voting for him support Israel as well.
I felt like he always knew who he was talking to and how to talk to them.
That is true. That is true. Well, would you like to watch the rest of the documentary there and just see what these people have to tell us? Yeah, I think this one's kind of interesting. It's nice to know, like, I think it gives us a nice little window into just what it's like to live in this part of the world.
The two different sides as well, the well off and the middle of the world.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's a very drastic difference.
yeah, and and probably very uncomfortable too to know that, like, this is currently happening in your country, right? And how to feel about it. Right? Okay, so let's continue here. Online people, the link is in Microsoft Teams, just like it was yesterday. We watched 20 minutes yesterday, so I think I'm just gonna turn it on here and start from 20 minutes and just let it play till the end, and then we'll come back and talk about what we've seen. Okay, so online people, start at 20 minutes. Link is in Microsoft Teams, and we'll see you at the end. Okay. So that's where it is. I mean,
Wow.
there's not,
The
there's not.
ending was a lot to process.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was rough. That was, it's tough to swallow.
Yeah, yeah, it is, right? And again, it's been, it's such a, it's kind of one of the things that's difficult about history, right? Is that sometimes you get these big, decisive events, right? It's something happens, and like you have bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, right? And those are big events, and then sometimes you just have this cumulative effect of, decades of, warfare and conflict and separation, and yeah, and you kind of get to a place like this where it's like, okay, like how do you untangle this knot, right? When it's been built up over decades, and there's not an easy solution here, or at least I don't see one, and in some ways it's easy to point the finger at a country like Israel, but then there's lots of other countries that are implicated in this as well, right? How easy would it have been early on for the United States to say, look, this is what you need to work out. You need to work out a deal with the Palestinians, or our military aid stops, right? And it would have been very easy for other countries to to sort of twist their arm and get them to do something, but now we're kind of at a point where it's too late for that, right? And yeah, like what?
I think there's anything that could be done.
Well, and from what you hear, there's seemingly not a lot of will to do anything, because yeah, people have lost hope, right? It's been decades of the same thing, right? And they're slowly sliding toward, again, what they say is an apartheid state where Israel has all the control and the Palestinians are fenced in, and yeah, and it seems like it's not on most people's radar unless the shooting starts, right? And we saw that, or was it earlier this year? I guess it was, right? We saw that earlier this year where these two, or maybe late last year, where these two groups came into conflict and rockets were firing back and forth, and people were getting upset and wondering where you stood on this issue.
That was earlier this year.
Earlier this year. But then, when the shooting stops, people kind of forget, but life goes on for Palestinians who are, increasing, continue to be pushed out of Israel, right? And to where, who knows, right? There's nowhere to go. Okay, well, I think that's all we have. That's all the history that we can deal with, that we can cram into 13 weeks.
World War I.
What's that?
From World War I.
From
all the way till now.
World War I, World War II, Cold War, China, Israel, Palestine, the whole Russia thing. I think we covered a lot of ground. Yeah, it's an eventful century, right?
Yeah. Way too eventful.
Way too eventful. But it's interesting because the way the world is today is very much a product of what happened in that century, right? And if you don't understand that, then yeah, something like Israel and Palestine makes no sense. What's happening in Russia doesn't make any sense. What's happening in China doesn't make any sense if you don't understand what came before, right? Okay, any last words? No?
Happy birthday again.
Thanks. Okay, that's it, good people. Thanks for being part of the class. Good luck on your exams next week, although I'm sure you won't need it, or hopefully you won't need it. But
Have a good holiday.
Have a
what's
good
that?
holiday.
Thank you, and hopefully we'll see some of you guys in September. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, bye everyone.
Enjoy your 25th tomorrow.